HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Battle of Gettysburg by Bruce Catton, read by Eric Martin. Introduction. On July 1st, 1863, Marcellus Jones, a young cavalry lieutenant from Illinois, was placed in command of a Union sentry post west of a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. Around 7:30 a.m., Jones saw a cloud of dust down the road. Confederate troops were marching towards his position. The officer grabbed a carbine, braced it on a fence post, and pulled the trigger. It would be the first of more than 1 million shots over the next 3 days, as early skirmishes escalated into the bloodiest battle ever fought in America. The previous month, General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had invaded Northern Territory, hoping to lure the Union Army into a fight to the finish. Under a scorching July sun, 150,000 men would push the limits of human endurance, and over a third of them entered history as casualties. That conflict marked a turning point in the struggle to preserve the Union. As President Abraham Lincoln would say in his immortal address 4 months later, the bravery and sacrifice of those soldiers would bring forth a new birth of freedom that would ultimately lead to equality for all its citizens. In this book, Bruce Catton, American Heritage's founding editor, brings to life the 150-year-old story of Gettysburg. The glory and pageantry of battle is here, and so is its horror and tragedy. In the stories of Northerners and Southerners alike, Catton gives us insight into the courage and tenacity of those who fought so nobly. Their sacrifice was not in vain. As Lincoln wrote, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, thanks to these brave Americans." Edwin S. Grosvenor, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher, American Heritage. 1. An Order of Magnitude. The June night was dark and warm, and a steady rain fell as several thousand Confederate cavalrymen lay sound asleep in the open fields near Salem, Virginia. They had no tents, and they were as wet as if they had fallen into a river, but they had seen worse nights than this. By the late spring of 1863, a Confederate cavalryman was tough enough to sleep anywhere as long as no one was shooting at him. The cavalry was getting a good night's rest, so when a courier came cantering up the muddy road, identified himself, and went on to headquarters, no one stirred except a drowsy staff officer who got up to take the courier's envelope. That envelope contained orders from General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, addressed to Major General James E.B. Jeb Stuart, who led Lee's cavalry. Stuart, like everyone else, was sleeping in the rain. As a major general, he was entitled to a tent. In fact, there was a farmhouse just 50 yards from his encampment. But Jeb Stuart refused to fare any better than his men, and if they slept on the ground in the rain, he would do the same. His adjutant, having opened the envelope, tramped across the wet grass to arouse the general, and, by the light of a lantern, Jeb Stuart sat up to read General Lee's orders. The orders were just what Stuart wanted. Lee was giving him a job, but also the leeway to find his own way to do it, and General Stuart's way in such matters usually had a little extra style and dash, a touch of daring that could turn a routine assignment into a picturesque adventure. As a result, Jeb Stuart had become the most famous cavalryman alive. As a good soldier, he was proud of his reputation and wanted to add to it. He read General Lee's dispatch and began to draft the order that would put his cavalry in motion. Jeb Stuart came from a line of men made famous by service to their country. Born on a Virginia plantation to Scotch-Irish parents, Archibald and Elizabeth Letcher Pannell Stuart, Jeb had 7 older siblings and 3 younger, but was one of only 5 sons to survive beyond youth. His father fought in the War of 1812 with the British, was prominent in Virginia politics, and was a representative in the United States House. His great-grandfather, Alexander Stuart, was a commander in the Revolutionary War. Homeschooled by his mother until he was 12, and then by his aunt and uncle, Judge James Ewell Brown, for whom he was named, Stuart enrolled at Emory and Henry College at age 15. That summer, Stuart was forbidden from enlisting in the Army because he was too young. 2 years later, in 1850, he joined the military academy at West Point on an appointment from United States House Representative Thomas Hamlet Averitt, who had defeated his father's re-election bid. Stuart finished West Point 13th in his class of 46, 10th in cavalry tactics, and was one of 8 honorary cavalry officers heralded for his horsemanship. He was second captain of the Cadet Corps. His weakest discipline was engineering, in which he graduated 29th, hampered by his poor drawing skills. Also at West Point, he received from his classmates the facetious nickname Beauty, for he was not a handsome young man. His slight chin was described as so short and retiring as positively to disfigure his otherwise fine countenance. His beard, grown in haste following graduation, was seen as an improvement. His first commission was to the United States Regiment of Mounted Riflemen in Texas. 3 months later, he joined the newly formed 1st Cavalry Regiment and was quickly advanced to first lieutenant. About this time he met and, after a brief courtship, married Flora Cook, whose father was Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook. Plans for a gala wedding at Fort Riley, Kansas, were set aside when news arrived that Stuart's father had died. Instead, the ceremony was small and attended by only a few family members. One daughter, born in 1856, died within a day. A second came in November 1857 and was named for her mother. In 1857, while battling the Cheyenne Indians in Kansas, Stuart took a bullet to the chest from an old-fashioned pistol, which barely broke the skin. His military prestige continued to grow. He received a patent in 1859 for inventing a saber hook for the cavalry, which improved the method in which sabers were attached to belts. He met up again with Lee, at this time a colonel, when radical abolitionist John Brown raided the National Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, a catalyst for the Civil War. Just days after being promoted to captain, Stuart resigned from the United States Army to join the Confederate States Army, for which he was commissioned lieutenant colonel of the Virginia Infantry under Major General Lee. At Harper's Ferry, he took command of the 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment, was promoted to colonel in July 1861, and by September was a brigadier general. The Civil War would pit Stuart against his father-in-law, Colonel Cook, who decided to stay with the United States Army even though his own son, John Rogers Cook, had joined the Confederates. He will regret it but once, and that will be continuously, Stuart wrote to his brother-in-law. Stuart's wife, Flora, had named their son, born in 1860, after her father, but, in disgust, Stuart had the name changed to James Ewell Brown, Jimmy Stuart, Jr. In the First Battle of Bull Run, Stuart's cavalry had scattered the Union infantry and pursued the fleeing Federalists. Next, he took command of the Confederate outposts along the upper Potomac River. Stuart was described in a letter from General Joseph E. Johnston to Confederate President Jefferson Davis as calm, firm, acute, active, and enterprising. Those qualities were about to be put to their greatest test yet. War goes by odd rules, and sometimes cause and effect lie a long way apart. A general who is awakened in the middle of the night makes up his mind about something and issues an order. A week or so later, on a battlefield many miles away, that order makes the difference between victory and defeat. In the early morning darkness of June 24th, 1863, few soldiers in the Confederate States Army had ever heard of the town of Gettysburg, far to the north in Pennsylvania. But they were going to fight there. 2. They will come booming. At the start of the Civil War, the North outnumbered the South in population by nearly 11 million, produced nearly all of the country's firearms and trains, and had a well-developed navy, which the South lacked. But the South had General Robert E. Lee. Davis's appointment of Lee to command the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862 is considered the best decision he ever made. By 1863, Lee was starting to invade the North, trying to carry the war out of Virginia and win the independence of the Southern Confederacy. Early in May 1863, his army had defeated the Federal Army of the Potomac, commanded by General Joseph Hooker, in the Battle of Chancellorsville, driving Hooker back north of the Rappahannock River and bringing the Federal campaign in Virginia to an abrupt halt. As a result, Lee had the power to say what was going to happen next. By taking the battle to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, Lee could secure the rich farms of the North to supply his army. Lee's career and command. Robert E. Lee was born and raised on a Virginia plantation, the son of Major General Light Horse Harry Lee III, who became Virginia's governor, and his second wife, Anne Hill Carter. His was considered one of Virginia's first families, emigrating from England in the 1600s. His mother grew up at Virginia's elegant Shirley plantation. His father, also a tobacco farmer and failed investor, spent a year in debtor's prison, then was gravely injured in a political riot in Baltimore, and died by the time Robert was 11. Robert was one of 6 children, to be raised by their mother alone. The family moved around a lot, often staying with friends and family for extended periods. Robert showed a propensity for math at Eastern View, a school for young gentlemen, and Alexandria Academy. A relative, William Henry Fitzhugh, helped Robert gain appointment to West Point in 1824, writing a letter that touted the Lee family history, but lied about Robert's age. He was 17, not 18. Robert hand-delivered the letter, but there was no room for him at West Point that year. He enrolled in the summer of 1825, where he excelled in engineering. Graduating in 1829 second in his class, Lee was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. That summer of 1829, Lee's mother died. Back in Virginia, Lee met and courted Mary Custis, a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, against the wishes of her father, George Washington Parke Custis, who thought him unsuitable based on the tarnished reputation of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee. Robert's first proposal of marriage was rebuffed, but by 1830 he had won over both Mary and her father. The summer of 1831 they were married. As a couple, they were devoted, but dynamically different. Lee's tidiness and punctuality were in contrast to his wife, a rich man's daughter accustomed to being waited on and waited for. With the Army Corps of Engineers, Lee was involved in the early construction of Fort Pulaski on the Savannah River in Georgia, and then Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula, where his first son, Custis Lee, was born. As assistant in the chief engineer's office in Washington, he helped draw the Ohio-Michigan state line, supervised the St. Louis harbor, and mapped the Des Moines Rapids. While Lee was boarded in Washington, his family lived in Arlington. About this time, Mary gave birth to their second child and became ill. She recovered after months spent bedridden and bore Robert 5 more children. Eventually, he returned to West Point, where he was appointed superintendent in 1852. It was there that he and Stuart first crossed paths, and the two became close and trusted family friends. Graduates of the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, made up the command of nearly every regiment deployed by both sides during the Civil War. The Union Army was led by 294 general officers from West Point, to the Confederates' 151. The Academy was established by Congress in 1802, graduating its first cadet in October of that year. It had served as an unofficial training ground since 1794. As an army post starting in 1778, it gained notoriety in an act of treason by Benedict Arnold, who attempted to sell it to the British. The first true test of battle for its cadets was in the Mexican-American War. 452 of its 523 graduates earned promotions or honors. Lee and Confederate President Jefferson Davis were among them, as was Union General Joseph Hooker. Lee's army was tough, hard, and accustomed to victory. The infantry was divided into 3 corps, each of which had about 20,000 men. First Corps, led by General James Longstreet, Second Corps under the command of General Richard Ewell, and Third Corps led by General A.P. Hill. With cavalry and artillery, the Army of Northern Virginia had, in all, close to 70,000 men. At Chancellorsville, Lee's best general, Stonewall Jackson, had lost his life, but Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill were good officers, and the men in the ranks had confidence in them and in themselves. Early clashes. Hooker's army was larger than Lee's. It had perhaps 90,000 men, but it was not at its best. It had been beaten several times, and it shared with President Lincoln the suspicion that Lee was a more effective general. It was acting as a barrier between Lee and the northern capital, Washington. When it moved, it did so in reaction to Lee, and not according to its commander's strategy. Hooker's forces lacked the cocky, aggressive spirit of Lee's army, and in spite of the difference in numbers, the two armies were evenly matched. Hooker had won command of the Army of the Potomac mostly by gall. He had a talent for elevating himself by pointing out the failings of others, including his superiors. Despite this fact, he was recognized as an aggressive military leader and won the respect of his soldiers. He was a hard drinker and a ladies' man. One cavalry officer described Hooker's headquarters as a combination bar-room and brothel. His nickname, the result of a journalist's clerical error, was Fighting Joe. Hooker's grandfather had served as a captain in the Revolutionary War. His first military appointment was as second lieutenant in the 1st United States Artillery during the Seminole Wars in Florida. During the Mexican-American War, he served for a time under General Zachary Taylor, who also commanded the regiment of Jefferson Davis. After the war in Mexico, Hooker took up farming in Sonoma County, California, and continued to cultivate the vices of gambling and drinking. He campaigned unsuccessfully for the California state legislature and sought appointment as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, but was rejected. He commanded the California militia for 2 years, starting in 1859. Following the Union Army's defeat at the Battle of Bull Run, Hooker wrote a letter to President Lincoln. In it, he assailed the Union commanders as incompetent and touted his own merits in seeking an appointment. It worked. As a brigadier general, he was given command of a volunteer regiment. Next, he was assigned to Major General George B. McClellan and given the responsibility of training troops for the war. Hooker's courage and leadership in the Battle of Williamsburg earned him a promotion to Major General. In part, it came at the expense of his commander, McClellan, who Hooker criticized openly. He blamed McClellan for the Union Army's failure to capture Richmond, saying, "He is not only not a soldier, but he does not know what soldiership is." In the Battle of Antietam, Hooker led the One Corps in driving back Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, but suffered a foot wound that forced him to leave the battlefield. The failure to seal the victory for the Union was again attributed to the cautious McClellan. Had Hooker remained on the field, he asserted, the Confederates would have been crushed. McClellan lost his command, replaced by Lincoln with Major General Ambrose Burnside. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside's troops suffered humiliating losses in a series of futile assaults, which earned him Hooker's disdain. Hooker criticized his commander as a wretch of blundering sacrifice. Burnside fired back, asking Lincoln to remove Hooker, who he called unfit to hold an important commission during a crisis like the present. Lincoln instead relieved Burnside of his duty and appointed Hooker to command the Army of the Potomac. The president's promotion of Hooker came despite an unflattering quote attributed to him by a New York Times correspondent. In criticism of Lincoln's leadership, Hooker had said, "Nothing will go right until we have a dictator, and the sooner the better." Lincoln responded with a letter to Hooker. "I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." The Army of the Potomac was revived under Hooker's leadership. He had boosted the troops' morale by making changes to their rations and improvements to the camp and drills. By the spring of 1863, Hooker bragged, "I have the finest army on the planet. I have the finest army the sun ever shone on. If the enemy does not run, God help them. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." The general had bold plans for an attack on Lee's Confederates in Virginia and the ultimate capture of Richmond. But, contrary to his aggressive military style, as Lee's army approached, Hooker pulled back and waited. In the small crossroads town of Chancellorsville, the Confederates assaulted the Army of the Potomac from both flanks, forcing it to retreat. It was Hooker's most stunning defeat, and has been called Lee's perfect battle. Early in the fighting, Hooker was injured when a wooden post he was leaning against was struck by a cannonball. Stubbornly, he had refused to relinquish command to his second, Major General Darius N. Couch. In the face of this defeat, there was only Hooker to blame, and generals lined up to criticize him and position themselves to replace him. The Cavalry in Virginia. The cavalry, commanded by Stuart, was the first to be drawn into the conflict. A Union ambush, led by Major General Alfred Pleasonton, pitted his 8,000 cavalry troopers and 3,000 infantrymen against Stuart's 9,500 Confederates at Brandy Station near Culpeper, Virginia. Stuart drove back the Union forces, proving the might of the Confederate cavalry in the Civil War's largest clash of two cavalries. Early in June, Lee began to move up to the Potomac River. Following victories at Winchester and Martinsburg garrisons, Ewell and the Second Corps had the advance, and by the middle of the month had crossed the river and were moving eastward across Pennsylvania toward Harrisburg. Hill and the Third Corps were not far behind, and Longstreet and the First Corps were marching down the Shenandoah Valley to follow Hill. Hooker, meanwhile, moved northward, 20 or 30 miles to the east, to keep pace. So far, Hooker had not sent any of his men across the Potomac. Here was where Stuart's cavalry came in. In the Civil War, an army commander like Lee wanted his troops to accomplish two goals: discover the enemy's location and keep their own a secret. Now, with most of the Army of Northern Virginia going above the Potomac, Stuart had to screen the invasion and keep a close watch on the position of the Federal Army. In effect, Stuart had to be Lee's eyes. Invading enemy territory was risky. It could not be done successfully unless the cavalry played its part. The dispatch Stuart read on that rainy night was an order telling him to get north of the Potomac and take position on Ewell's front and right flank. The obvious way to do this was for Stuart to form up behind Longstreet, follow his infantry to the Potomac, and then fan out to the east, overtaking Ewell somewhere west of Harrisburg. This would be safe, but rather slow and laborious, and Stuart believed there was a better way. Hooker's army was still south of the Potomac, drawn up east of the Bull Run Mountains, apparently marking time until Hooker could determine Lee's next move. Stuart decided to go directly east, march around Hooker's army, cross the Potomac, and then go cross-country and pick up Ewell. This would accomplish Lee's goal, break Hooker's communications with Washington, open the way for gaudy adventures, and shed new glory on the Confederate cavalry. Stuart had 5 cavalry brigades, each with a strength of between 1,500 and 2,000 men. He would leave 2 to watch the Blue Ridge passes and follow in the army's rear. With the other 3, he would slice through the Bull Run Mountains, circle around Hooker, and go north to pick up Ewell. Orders went out, and at midnight the next night, Stuart and 3 cavalry brigades set off. The Potomac. Stuart did not go far before he ran into trouble. Hooker's army covered more ground than Stuart expected, and it was moving toward the Potomac. The roads Stuart wanted to use were full of Federal infantry, too strong for cavalry to brush aside. Stuart had to turn south, and then he had to go farther east than he had planned, and when he tried to swing north for the Potomac, Hooker's soldiers were still in the way. He had thought that his hard-riding cavalry could go around the Yankee army quickly, getting up into Maryland and crossing into Pennsylvania in a matter of a day or 2. In the end, it took him 8 days to rejoin the Confederate army. Lee's army, knowing nothing about Stuart's situation, was moving on according to plan. Ewell, in the lead, approached the Susquehanna River, his divisions widely separated, his left wing at Carlisle, his right wing 30 miles away at York. The Federals had no troops in Pennsylvania except for untrained militia units. Ewell collected supplies from the rich farming country and felt that he had nothing to worry about. Lee's orders were to treat the civilians across the Potomac respectfully and do little to affect their lives. Reimbursements were paid for supplies and horses seized by the Confederates, though they were not well met by the farmers and merchants. Towns, such as York, that could not stock the troops with supplies were threatened with destruction unless indemnities were paid. About 40 African Americans, mostly freemen, were seized and sold into slavery. 30 or 40 miles west of Ewell, Lee's other 2 army corps were moving. A.P. Hill headed east through the mountains, and Longstreet was not far behind him at Chambersburg. All of the army, except for Stuart, was in Pennsylvania, and although the different pieces of it were far apart, this could do no harm as long as the Army of the Potomac remained in Virginia. As far as Lee knew, that was where it was. He had heard nothing from Stuart, and he assumed that this reliable cavalryman would quickly inform him if the Federals began to cross the river. He sent couriers to Ewell, telling him to take Harrisburg if possible. Lee remained in Chambersburg with Longstreet. On the evening of June 28th, one of General Longstreet's scouts had been prowling behind the Federal lines and made his way into camp with startling news. Hooker had crossed the Potomac and had his army concentrated in the vicinity of Frederick, Maryland. The Federal army was closer to Lee than Lee's advance corps was. If it moved promptly, as it was most likely to do, it might destroy the scattered bits and pieces of Lee's army one at a time. Lee had no idea where Stuart was, and for all he knew, some great disaster might have befallen the cavalry. The odds were against him. He was deep in enemy country, almost cut off from his own base, and time was running out. At all costs, he had to pull his army together and prepare for battle. Couriers galloped along Pennsylvania roads, hurrying through the night with urgent messages from General Lee. Ewell must withdraw from the Susquehanna and forget about Harrisburg. The troops at Chambersburg must move east of the mountains, and the whole army should reassemble without delay at the most convenient spot. This spot, apparently, would be somewhere near the little market town of Gettysburg. Stuart, meanwhile, had crossed the Potomac at last, well downstream, not far from Washington, and was driving north trying to find Lee's army, which he was supposed to screen and guide. His men had ridden hard, and the horses were tired. Also, the whole Federal army lay between Stuart and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?